Okay, hi everyone. So sorry for going a bit overboard yesterday. I'll try to be as concise as possible this session. I blame it on MCO. Uh, in this sort of like day and age, it's very hard to sort of like keep track of time on my end. And so I'm losing the kind of like temporal rhythm that I normally sort of like have. That's no excuse. So let's sort of like go straight into our sort of final point in this week's session, which is really about generating visual materials or creating visual materials within a research project uh, that can help to complement or enrich your oral historical sort of project. So historically, I guess, when you do an oral history interview, generally you really just do the recording, right? But today, I think there are oral historians are also exploring different kinds of like different ways to incorporate the visual sort of like material. Why they do that is something that I've discussed in the previous lectures about the very close relationship between orality and visuality. Okay, so today we're gonna see the uh, how they sort of like do this. The first thing is that very often this is used to help facilitate a participant's capacity to communicate complex emotions surrounding a particular episode or incident that for him or her is very difficult to verbalize. Uh, at times, this is also very useful in cases where one encounters interview subjects that have a language barrier. Uh, uh, so the most common example in this case is when you picture an anthropologist going to a place where the community is very uh, economically sort of like disadvantaged, and as a result doesn't have the kind of say education or has the sort of like capacity to discuss complex issue and in and what happens in such a scenario is that the anthropologist could do two things. First, he might be able to sort of like take down photographs and therefore imposing his perspective, his or her perspective about the particular community and use that as a way to frame and represent the community. Or what I'm suggesting here is that the anthropologist might give the cameras, give different sort of like cameras, give out a few cameras to different interview subjects and allow them to take photos. So what comes back, what we get are photographs that shows the perspectives of the interview subjects, that perspective that captures their voice. Of course, what is considered as voice here is a photographic image, right? That is sort of like framed through the experience, through the interest, and through the eyes of those who took the photographs. And this is now the interview subjects. Uh, so that's one way that the visual can be particularly useful in overcoming the kind of like language barrier. But more pertinent, perhaps, to our discussion is how the use of sort of like visualization can also really help to sort of like communicate very complex sort of like incidents and sort of like emotions, which we'll look at a bit in a bit. Okay, the second point, and I want to just quickly point this out, and we can discuss this in class. I won't sort of like mention this a lot, is that in group discussions, in group interviews, which sometimes you might actually sort of like organize or run. Oral history interviews are not just sort of like one-to-one conversation. It can be sort of like done in a group. A kind of participatory drawing exercise can be a useful avenue to facilitate group conversation, especially in groups where people don't really sort of like know each other very well, and you know that there's a dominant voice versus someone who's like quieter. So this is to sort of like create a different avenue to sort of for you to sort of like get a much more balanced view of the different kinds of like perspectives that might emerge from the group conversation. Okay, what is like facilitating? What is this idea of facilitating sort of like difficult emotions like you know, we have examples from history. For example, Liu Kang's 1946 chop suey. Right after the war, what he did was created a comic book, and this comic book depicts, you know, the sufferings of like the Chinese community during the Japanese occupation in Singapore itself. And while it is sort of like published in English, but I think it went through numerous sort of, it became very popular, and its popularity, I guess, is not just due to the fact that, you know, it's published in English, but it's actually due to the fact that it is a very visual comic book. It's accessible, it's graphic, it's immediate, it conveys very sort of like, it talks about very difficult sort of subject matter in a way that is very relatable and understandable and readable to a lot of different public. Don't forget, after the war, half of the population is still not sort of like educated. Most of them can't even sort of like read the newspaper, whether in any of the languages. So visualization does have a sort of like advantage in the sense that if you draw in a sort of like figurative manner, it can sort of like reach out, and it can become accessible to a whole wide range of public that you never anticipate. Right? I'm going to talk more specifically about this, another sort of like project, which is you know, the use of sort of like you know, visual symbols in Tam Si Hwa's sort of like 50 Years of Silence, a recently sort of like released documentary last year, right, on the May 13 riot. So it documents this Ng family that lived in Kampong Baru when the race riot broke out in 1969, and so there's this sort of like segment where, alongside with the oral historical account of you know, the family's experience, what you see is also a juxtapositioning, meaning that there is a comparison of bringing together of different sort of like elements of the Ng family, so that represents the Ng family's past, right? So you see here a drawing done by, you know, a school you know, Sunny class sort of like drawing about a fire that happened during, possibly maybe during the riots. There's an essay about with the title "My Family," and then there's also a sort of family portrait, a photo studio sort of like portrait. That's very common in all our sort of like family albums, right? You would have sort of like seen them before. So these are things that we're all very sort of like familiar with, and by bringing them together, what it's able to do is to give the story that is being told, the oral story that's being told, a different kind of evocative charge. So it makes it all the more powerful because these are very graphic and these are very visual things that every one of us while watching the movie can identify on some level. We've all sort of like written this type of school essay. We've all done this type of drawings before. We've all, or we have like family members or seniors in our family who have taken this kind of like photo studio sort of like portrait. So these are things that makes the story relatable, because suddenly this Ng family is not some abstract kind of like disembodied voice that's just telling you about their hardships and pain and having to sort of like move out of like Kampong Baru. They are also sort of like people who participate in the things that we participate in, and thereby it gives us that sort of very immediate, very strong sort of like connection to the story that is being sort of told in the documentary itself. Now let's compare this, for example, to all the photographs that's being sort of shot of May 13 during the May 13 sort of like riots. There are, you can sort of like, you know, okay, say what about, you know, going to the archives and looking at or the old photographs, and make it do a comparison. And it is a very productive comparison in the sense that when we look at the stuff that was photographs that exist during the time, you get a sense that the photos really show you only a very distant view. It's almost like most of them are landscape. You don't get the kind of like close up that you see up there. And therefore, in I think Malaysia Kini sort of like oral history project that was done in 2019, 2 years ago now, they got like the graphics editor Azlan Zamhari to actually sort of create new graphics, comics that would help us to sort of like visualize and understand the stories that they were able to compile of people who remembered living through the May 13th sort of like riots. And so pairing these sort of like illustration with the oral history sort of like transcript itself, we get a much stronger kind of like way of engaging. It gives us another entry point into the story. So in case you haven't sort of like seen the website, the really nice thing is that the nice thing about the archives is that it captures all the stories in multiple languages, right? So there's bound to be a language that you will not understand. For me, it's Tamil. I do not understand the sort of like Tamil sort of like language, but there's by including the sort of like a visual illustration in the archive itself, what it does is it provides a kind of like binding glue. Say all these sort of like language groups, as much as they're isolated, they're really connected in some strange way. And the connection is this very tragic incident that the archive is hoping to make us become aware of. And simply adding this additional sort of like element of illustration into sort of the archive, it immediately sort of like opens up the archive to a much more relatable reading of it. Okay. When I said I would touch a bit on sort of like the group projects, I'm not sort of a psychotherapist, so I won't go specifically into the way you can sort of like facilitate group discussion by sort of like creating, by allowing participants to also draw at the same time as they're having that discussion, right? But maybe to sort of point to a much more creative possibility in this direction is Sharon Chin's participatory sewing project. She calls it In the Skin of a Tiger, Monument to What We Want, to do kita. I think in the project itself, she created 2 events. And in these events, she invited members of the public, anyone who wanted to sort of come to sit with her. And what they did was she laid the banners down on the floor and they sew. They spend time sort of like sewing and talking and having a sort of like very candid conversation about anything really. I think this happened after the sort of like election. So it was a general period in which she wanted conversation. She wanted to foster conversation about what kind of future we want to sort of like build together, right? So a lot of these things might not always be, a lot of the conversation might not always be sort of like captured on, recorded. And perhaps that's not the main point. But the main point is that the participants leave some kind of like trace mark. The trace mark might be a poem, but it might not even be a poem. It might be just a few lines because not everyone can sew properly, right? But nevertheless, they left an indelible sort of like mark there, and that constitutes a kind of like voice as well. Don't forget, mark making is very sort of like powerful way of registering some kind of like presence of oneself in a particular place in time. So in this way, I guess with Sharon's sort of project, what she was able to do is then sort of like use the participatory sort of like art making or visualization format in order to create a kind of like almost like a collective voice, right? Which I think for her is much more monumental than erecting a sort of stone statue to commemorate, the victory of the past election. Of course, now things have sort of like changed. So that's the past. So the next thing that I want to sort of like raise is that we can think of the visual method and in three different sort of like in many different sort of like approaches, and I will only sort of like highlight three here. Okay, the first is drawing and tracing as visual analysis, and then we'll look at documenting spatial knowledge and cultural practice, and then finally communicating researchers' conceptual frame. Okay, what do I mean by the first one? So drawing and tracing as a visual analysis. Now, what I like to do is you remember the last sort of like session where I sort of like give a primer of an introduction to what visual analysis is. So I also sort of like found that if you don't think that you're that comfortable doing sort of like visual analysis on your own, very often it is very helpful to sort of like use drawing or tracing, meaning if you're working on a photograph, just put a paper over the photograph, print it out, so there's tracing paper over the photograph. Or if you are using things like Procreate on your iPad, just download a high-res image and then sort of like use Procreate to create another layer on it so that you can begin to sort of like trace the image out with your own hand. And as you can see from Aurelia Azule's account here, she says that when she began to draw this photograph, she was surprised to discover in this photograph of something that from the International Committee of Red Cross Archive that wouldn't allow her to show, that she began to realize many details that has escaped her attention. She was too occupied by the central sort of like figure marching over here, and this would in some ways be the sort of like studium, right, that was discussed. Barth's sort of like notion of studium that I discussed in the previous sort of like lecture, because of the centrality of the figure within the picture sort of like frame itself. However, drawing itself and tracing this image and trying to recall this image, she's forgotten all these sort of like aggregates, and suddenly, because she has to draw them, they become sort of like much more visible to her. And then she realized that this sort of like process of migration, of moving, of being dislocated, is not just a solitary experience of one single person, but it's an act where people are helping one another. Right, and so this immediately sort of like changes her understanding of what she is looking at as well. Right, so visual analysis has tracing and drawing has the power to sort of like do that as a introductory sort of like step to do visual analysis, because it makes us pay attention to things that might escape our attention if we simply write them down as sort of like notes. Okay, I won't go into this. Maybe we can talk about this later. So, for example, I just want to give you an example of what tracing sort of like looks like. Typically, say, for example, in Manukau sort of like 1,000 islands, he gave a very good sort of like example of how you can sort of do tracing, where you sort of like simply put a tracing paper over, a postcard or an image, and then you simply just lakar lah, draw out the outline lah, and from the outline itself, you can sort of like color in things, and then you get an understanding of how space sort of like works. In this case, he was interested to understand how traditional market looked like in Southeast Asia. So he found different sort of like references to help him build a sort of like an idea of what a marketplace might look like historically in the past. And so from that, then, we move to this, documenting spatial knowledge and cultural practice expressed through local visual language here. So what do you mean by sort of like spatial knowledge here? So like, for example, when I think I am visual narrative, or I think it's titled something else, I don't remember. This is Lee Feng's project up in Penang, that just sort of like, I think that was recently sort of published. And what she did was, instead of simply just interviewing people in the conventional oral history sort of like method, she brought along like, she worked with artists. So artists were sort of like brought along. And what they do is that each of the person that they interview, based on their sort of like profession and the place that they work in, they're located in Penang, the artist would then sort of like help to visualize, to create a visual sort of like understanding of the environment that this person sort of lived in. So there's a lot of the discussion that goes on. It's not just about, you know, what they do, how expensive were things and all that kind of like stuff, and what are the sort of like things alike, but how do all these things, how do all these experience fit within a space? What was your sort of like work environment like? So for example, here, I think she was working on like either an office person or money teller, I don't remember. So it's like half the time it's like figuring out what are the furnitures that are being used. This gives us a better sort of like immersive understanding of a person and an experience within a particular space itself. So after that, I think they you know, the artist then sort of like interprets and creates a kind of like a creative sort of like celebratory kind of like drawing to capture the life of this person. But this would then be sort of like shown alongside the short excerpt from the interview. But I sense the full transcript and the backstories haven't yet been uploaded online. So this is the part that I think will be very rich for future sort of like researchers interested in understanding Penang sort of like cultural history. And to understand sort of like culture, you have to understand it within specific sort of like place and context, right? And sometimes it's very hard for us to imagine what it was like. So using the visual sort of like form, collaborating together with the interview subjects to help to sort of like map out, you know, how things look like, or where were things in relation to other things. You know, how might a map of KL look like in the 1950s? All these are sort of like very rich. These are some of the rich possibilities that you can sort of like consider when you include the visual method. Okay, so another example from when we talk about cultural, that's like, you know, spatial practice. So when we talk about cultural practice, then, you know, another example from like our Thousand Island is then he would in some ways create short little manuals, you know, about things like beetle chewing, sireh, right? You know, how does sireh look like? What are the sort of like components? So you see this in a lot of like today's, all the Wenqing book, hipster sort of like publication, right? Where they introduce you to, I don't know, kopitiam culture. And then they would have like, you know, a section that looks at all the different kuehs in Malaysia, or all the different sort of like coffee roasts in Malaysia. I mean, it's also a sort of like fun and accessible way where information can be communicated in a structured sort of like manner, in a systematic manner that makes it easy for the reader to understand. And so the visual it has a huge capacity to sort of like communicate that, and it immediately, instead of sort of like trying to describe, you know, the whole sort of like ritual, and the process and the importance attached to the ritual of sort of like gathering together to sort of like partake in the chewing of the beetle of the sireh. A simple drawing like this would capture that and immediately sort of like communicate that to your reader already. Why this is such an important, this is such a lively, and this is such a communal, and even interestingly gendered kind of like space in Manka's sort of like depiction, right? So the last point I want to raise is communicating with researchers sort of like conceptual frame. Now this is a bit sort of like more sort of like complicated, but essentially, I'm going to sort of like talk about this through an anthropologist sort of like work. So some of you might be familiar with, in anthropology, a huge part of anthropology, there's an interest in studying about sort of like human relationships, right? Who is related to who? How does one sort of like consider one person an ancestor and all this kind of like stuff? So Evan Pritchard, I was in Africa studying the Nuer clan, and in this particular book itself, I think there's the Nuer, he was discussing the different ways we can understand kinship, or how people sort of like understand their relationship with one another within the community itself. So the first approach is very typical. We come with a specific sort of like idea of what family relation is like, and therefore we impose that. So typically, even for us today, we rely on the tree model, right? So it's like, father, mother, and then the different branches of the family, and then everything grows out into a nice little tree itself. So this is, for Alan Pritchard's, the imposition of how an anthropologist might impose a European sort of like model that all of us are familiar with onto another sort of like society, which helps him to, in some ways, understand what it helps him to sort of like understand is, wait, what I'm saying here. Sorry. All right. Yeah. Okay. So that's the tree sort of like model. Then, but then as he was sort of like having his discussion with his interview subject, he realized that in the Nuer clan itself, I think there isn't, they use very different sort of like set of vocabulary. Although they do use the word branch, which is metaphorically sort of like related to a tree, they often sort of also use other words, such as a hearth, which is a fireplace where the food is cooked, and the entrance of the hut, right? And so what happens is that when in the course of sort of like discussion, he realizes that they would sort of like use a stick to draw on the ground, and discovered that the lineage is visualized not like this as a tree, where you're from a single ancestor, you branch out to many different sort of like progeny or future generation, but actually it starts with a center point, yeah, and then it radiates outwards towards different sort of like direction. And in this system, the length of the lines and the proximity of one line to another line indicates the relationship between the lineages. Now, this is a view that comes from them themselves. So in seeking to understand the segmentation of, these lineages and their relationship, I think this is the abstract sort of like version that one could sort of like rely on because it's something that you're familiar with, but it doesn't really sort of like explain the relationship between segment as like this one does. Jock is further from Kun, whereas these two are sort of like seen in much more closer proximity, and therefore sort of like shares a closer sort of like alliance between one another. And this is a kind of like local relation that is better expressed in a visual language from the perspective of the Nuer, from a Nuer sort of like visual vocabulary. And this is similar to like the example that I point to when we look at the Perak map, right, versus the European map of the Perak River. Nevertheless, over the course of the conversation, Evan Pritchard also found that actually the system of relationship is rather relative, right? And not very absolute itself. So therefore, he didn't think that, you know, how do you then sort of like uh, not sort of like set this in stone, because this is something that is meant to be sort of like transitory. Uh, and so he needed to then sort of like find a different way to represent this sort of like system, because they themselves don't always sort of communicate this transitory sort of like nature in which they then proclaim or announce this lineage. So for them, the lineage is something that someone assigned him or herself to really depends on the context of the inquiry. So in a dispute, a man or a village who might choose to ignore some of the higher level lineage in favor of the lower level lineage that you would unite them in a conflict against another enemy. So conversely, disputes of opposing sort of like lower level groups could set aside those differences and unite against another common bigger enemy. Therefore, this last diagram itself, he tries to represent this dynamic as composed of scalable units of fission and fusion. So when, for example, Z1 fights Z2, no other section is involved. But when Y1 fights X1, Y1 fights X1 over here, and therefore, in this case, Y2 also sort of like fights with X2 and so on. And so they have sort of like different sort of like configuration, and lineages help them to sort of like determine what is the configuration and who you're supposed to stand behind during moments of sort of like conflict. Bonds and ties to the past, therefore, how you choose to sort of like recognize who is close to you and who are your sort of like closest ancestors and who are your most powerful ancestors are not permanent, but only articulated every time when it is sort of like needed. So therefore, by offering this interpretive reading, Pritchard even sort of like makes visible a contextual pattern that is not visible if we were to impose the tree-like genealogy model that from Europe, or more commonly sort of like understood today, to understand the family sort of like relationship within the Noah society, nor does the sort of like radiating line models that has been generated from within the clan itself, perhaps even it's so accurate in its sort of like description. And therefore, because he finds this as unsatisfactory, he also sort of like came up with a new kind of like model to account for, the scalable sort of like contingent relationship that is described by this final sort of like diagram here. It's a little bit sort of like confusing, but I think what it does show is that it offers another kind of like possibility for you to think about how you can sort of like visualize the data and information that you might sort of like receive in an oral history project, okay? So finally, to plan ahead for sort of like Saturday, and this is the final part, I want to invite all of us to work on an experimental exercise in collaborative map making and timeline building to create a kind of like the beginning of hopefully a kind of generous data. So for all the links mentioned in this talk that I will show you in a bit, please open up the YouTube page for this recorded video. The links will be located in the information panel so that you can click directly and go to the links, okay? So let me just stop sharing my screen and then share you my other screen over here. Okay, so principally, I would like, first of all, I would like you to sort of like go to this website called ArcGIS Story Maps. And if you can, sign up an account with ArcGIS Story Map. So it's not just ArcGIS, yeah? I want to specifically use sort of like ArcGIS story maps. So you go to this, sign up for an account. ArcGIS is related, but it's for another function, and it's closer to the kind of GIS mapping that was discussed in the first lecture. You know, the kind of like inferences that you can draw. But when we do a story map, it fulfills a different sort of like function. Okay, if you can sign up something like this, you will sort of like, you know, you can sort of like start creating sort of like stories, have a feel around, have a play around. Normally, it's not a very difficult sort of like platform to use. If you have time, sort of just play around with it, get a feel of it, and you'll realize that it's actually also a very intuitive sort of like system. So what is nice is that you can really sort of create visual essays. So for example, this one I did very sort of like quickly. I wanted to look at, say, modern architecture in KL in the early and mid 20th century by a particular architecture firm, right? So I got the data. And so in the early 20th century, I managed to sort of like map out all the different sort of like architectural projects that the firm undertook, including the, you know, the Chinese Assembly Hall over here, and all that kind of stuff. And then I just sort of like put them in. But what you can do is also actually include images and video in them and a description. Okay, and what you're, and they have very nice sort of like skin interface and all that kind of stuff. And then you're able to write stuff, include sound clippings and things like that, to create almost like a visual zine, like a digital sort of like zine that has a very sort of like intuitive, interactive, and playful sort of like interface. And so what I did in this instance was then to sort of like have a bit of a sort of like sense of time. So the pre-war sort of like architectural projects, and then the post-war kind of like architectural projects that the same architecture firm did in Kuala Lumpur. And so these are some of the post-war sort of like examples. That includes, you know, the Brunei House and on all the factories in Petaling Jaya. Okay, all these kinds of like stuff. So that's just an example of how you can sort of like really play with this particular platform, which we are going to actually use. Okay, on the day itself. But what are we going to sort of like work on? The first thing I want to sort of like talk about is perhaps to introduce you to this lovely website called Digital Gems. It's run by the NUS Library. So what you have here are two very interesting sort of like folders. But the folder I want to, you can have a look at both. So you can look at the Chinese in Southeast Asia folder. You click on this, it brings you to, you know, more folders that are organized according to different sort of like themes like history, philosophy, economy, you know, trade and all that kind of like stuff. And within them, there will be books. So a lot of the more recent stuff are still restricted, but you know, that's luckily that's also and also because they're more popular, and a lot of people only work on those issues. So I find it also a bit, I mean, come on now, let's work on something else, right? And luckily, some of the earlier stuffs are in fact sort of like open access now. So there's a lot of like materials that, like for example, if you look at this, you can actually sort of like, you know, just open up any of the pages, go in there, and sign in as a guest user, public. Okay. Okay, ask me for this. What is this? Board. Okay. So, and then you can, you know, it opens up to the pages. Okay. To this lovely stuff over here. Mm-hmm. So, So have a look around at that. But what I wanted to point you out to is the Chinese newspaper. So go look at the sort of Chinese newspapers, and then it's separated to Malaysia and Singapore. Look at the Malaysia sort of like section, and you get a few sort of like newspaper. It's not as comprehensive as the Singapore collection, but in the Malaysian newspaper, what you have are principally newspapers from, I think, KL and Penang. Okay. So there are a few things that I want you to consider. The first is the Chiao Seng Bao, Chiao Seng Bao here. And the second is Guangshi Wu Bao. And then the third is Xing Yi Guan Bao, Yi Qun Bao. And then the fourth one is also the Yi Qun Bao. So these are the Kuala Lumpur newspapers. And as you can tell, this is from the late 19th century. This is from the 1910s, during the sort of like height of the revolution and the establishment of the Republic of China. And this one is much later, from the 1920s all the way to 1936. Okay, so you see also, I've opened them up. So what you get is if you click on any one of them and go into it, you get these things. And then you click on it, you get the newspaper itself. Okay, so when you look at the earliest newspaper, Guangshi Wu Bao, for example, from the late 19th century, I mean, it's pretty hard to read. It'll take a whole day for you to read it, but try and see. And it's also pretty standard, so there's not a lot of information, and you find that the advertisements keeps repeating itself. And then there's the better one. And then you see major improvement in the Chiao Seng Bao. So more staff, more news, more advertisements, more sort of like topics of sort of like discussion, and the beginnings of sort of like literary sort of like conversations, right? And then, so you can have a look at this. And then finally, there is the Xing Yi Qun Bao. So now it's 1930s, height of sophistication, so much. People started using sort of like photographs. You have huge news, cigarette advertisements, huge page of advertisements, advertisements of sort of like exhibitions and shows and everything. What I want you to do is that we can on Saturday, sorry, I need to drink that. So what we can do on Saturday is to have a discussion and see how we can sort of like use these materials in a productive and interesting way to create a kind of like collaborative map on either ArcGIS or we can start off with Google Cultural Map. This is all up for sort of like discussion, but ultimately we might want to sort of like think of creating a kind of a story map of Kuala Lumpur. Right. So from the perspective of either Chinese newspapers, or it can be expanded to look at sort of like many different things. Or actually, I mean, since it's an oral history sort of like project, can it be an oral history of sort of like Kuala Lumpur? Using this as a way to help us to visualize, not just the oral historical sort of like records themselves, but photographs. Things that can help us to sort of like understand KL through the sort of like voice and perspectives of different people living in KL. So initially, and what I wanted to sort of like suggest to you is that we can maybe sort of have you guys all separated into different groups, and each group with about 4 to 5 people, and hopefully as diverse as possible. We'll think of ways to sort of like divide up the group, but principally each group will handle a particular map, and each map will focus on a particular theme. And these themes it can be thematic, or it can be according to different sort of like historical period. Okay, but I thought as an exercise of what we can sort of like do in class on Saturday is to first think of, you know, I've always been interested in trying to map out all the different bookshops in Kuala Lumpur. I don't know if we can do that, or we might have sort of like different ideas as you go through these materials. But I want you to sort of like get a sense of what the collection is here in the Chinese, in Southeast Asia sort of like collection, and the collection in the Chinese newspaper. Just give you a sort of like sense of feel. You don't actually have to know everything, but it's just to sort of like have an idea. And then I'm going to sort of like point you to this lovely resources called 东南亚华人历史文献. So a lot of the stuff is already in here, but in here, in either one of these, but some of the stuff are not there as well. So and this is especially the sort of if you look at the Malayan stuff, like, you know, some of the old sort of like school, uh, the 教育期刊 and all this kind of like stuff are not sort of like always in the digital, they are sort of collection. So this is also a very nice sort of like thing to sort of like look through. You know they have things like, you know, 公务上学, 公务学校 sort of like books. There's a lot of very interesting sort of like photograph. But what's interesting is also like, you know, all the 国展 exhibition. The catalogs are amazing, right? They're not just amazing for the visuals that they have in there, but there are a lot of sort of like advertisements of different sort of like shops. So in some ways, you can really sort of like piece together, you know, a map of like soy trade within a particular, within the Chinese sort of like community, using all these sort of like information. One of my favorite is this sort of like is this one, the 四周府华侨商业交通陆续. So this is the boring part where it's all the tauges. But if you scroll all the way down, you have this very lovely kind of like grid-like visualization of all the different businesses in different towns across the Federated Malay States. Right. So this in itself is wonderful. In a way, it's a visual document, but you can sort of also extract this information out if you're working on a specific project. So what have I found useful in this? So previously, before I was, you know, thinking of story map, I normally use sort of like Google to Google My Maps. It's called Google My Maps to actually sort of like map out all my things, and based on all these kinds of like data, during MCO during the first MCO when we couldn't go out, all I did was just spend time going through every single one of them, and I extracted all the information out to create this database of all the photo studios in Malaysia and Singapore from 1840s to 1980s. So it has about, I think, 500 entries now, and it's still going. There's still more stuff that I've been discovering. Most recently, I realized the Japanese also have their own sort of like directory. Of course, then the English have their own directory. So really sort of like compiling all this information, I'm able to sort of like build up this database. And, you know, typically in a database, I will have all that sort of like information about the particular photo studio, and then the kinds of like the site itself, because then you can use Street View to sort of like do the viewing. We can't go out during MCO, and then all that kind of like stuff, like all the information that I managed to sort of like find online and all that kind of thing. So for example, yeah, all these kinds of like things. So this was a very sort of like painful project, and I wish I could have done it collaboratively. So in this sense, I was wondering, you know, it's a bit of an unfulfilled sort of like project for me to see if this kind of mapping could work in a collaborative way. I think why this is important is because what we are trying to do here is to sort of like think about the kind of research that we do as creating also sort of like data that is generous, because we you sort of like host it on all these sort of like open platforms, what this does is that you're creating data that belongs to the commons. You don't hold a copyright over this data. It can be attributable to you and your efforts, and people will acknowledge that. But nevertheless, it's not like, you know, you run a cultural organization and you try to sort of hoard the information and you get worried if people don't sort of like acknowledge you. You sort of like make it available to the world in the hope that people will further do more research on this particular topic. I mean, I won't go sort of like too much into it, but this is something that I hope that we can sort of like think of possibly sort of like doing on this Saturday as we play around with the ArcGIS story map platform here, because I think this is a good platform to sort of start with because it's more sort of intuitive. It's maybe a bit more difficult or a bit too clumsy, clumsy to use compared to this. So what we can do is also to start the mapping here on Google Culture Map, Google My Maps, and then transfer the information here. It's not too difficult to sort of like do that too. There's ways to sort of like, you know, transfer from one platform to another. I find it sort of like easier to sort of like map it here only because I'm more familiar with this. I've been doing different kinds of like map, right? So this is the largest database that I've built, but I also sort of like use this to build maps of riots. You know, how processional sort of like routes where, you know, the Indian Muslim sort of like community process around Penang Island itself, and how that then leads to, you know, the specific sort of like European, the neighborhoods, the different sort of like Chinese sort of like secret society turfs, and including like, you know, where all the sort of like riots broke out, all that kind of like stuff, and then incidents that sort of like happen as a result of all the riots. You know, this is a much more sort of like complex map where I used to sort of like store historical data that I want, and that I want it to be easily retrievable, because once I know I map it out onto a geographical sort of like feature, I can sort of like see things. I mean, I can remember things better. I know where things are located. And this helps me to sort of like get those information back better. So typically, you know, if I were to even sort of look at this, so I know like, you know, there will be quotes and sources and notes of where I sort of like got them. There will be images, the archival images I want to sort of like associate with this particular thing, you know, this particular sort of like procession. You know, even this Boria group, for example, you know, I have photos of it. I have their sort of like songs that are sort of like recorded, and then all that kind of like information. It's all very neatly sort of like put there. And then now I know where they're located within sort of like Penang Island. And this also then shows me how there's how the particular performing art sort of like culture, the particular sort of like performance actually sort of like emerged from, you know, the marginalization of the Malay and Indian sort of like community from the economic sort of like center of Penang itself, simply because you see all these groups emerging slightly outside of the economic sort of like the business sort of like heart of Penang. So I mean, there's a lot more. I won't sort of like go too much into this, only to say this is also something possible when you want to map out something that is more chronological. Another thing you can also do is that you can create simply a walking tour, right? So this is a walking tour I did for, I think, the Global Humanities Institute that's run by the Jiao Tong University in Taiwan. When they came to KL, so I had to take them on the tour of KL. So I did a sort of my iconic Migrant City, a walking tour, looking at like the history of sort of like migration, you know, starting from I think the hotel all the way to you know, the Masjid Jami, the confluence between the Klang and Gombak River. So I also included sort of like songs, like contemporary sort of like account, and then sort of like describing like the various sort of like routes that, and finally leading to the Padang. So I deliberately sort of chose this as the end point rather than the starting point, only to sort of like allow the participants to get a perspective of how migration really is, a story from below. And when we want to look at the stories from below, we need to sort of like look at both the historical sort of like arc of migration, the problems that heritage continues to sort of like frame us into, different sort of like cultural pockets, but also using the tour, we then sort of like look at historical migration alongside with contemporary sort of like migration. So it's the Filipino community in Kota Raya and all these kinds of like stuff, and the Bangladeshi community in Masjid Jame, all these things sort of like come together 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 with like the historical waves of sort of like Indian and Chinese migration, and even sort of like Malay migration to KL. So walking tour can be one particular sort of like format where you can even sort of like chart out routes across a city space to invite people to use this on their next sort of like walk around KL. So these are some examples. We'll talk more, and these are sort of like things for you to think about. And then we can sort of like discuss together what we want to do and how we want to sort of like do this. But essentially what I'm doing is that I'm freeing you up from all the lectures so that on Saturday itself, we actually have 3 hours to work on this. How cool is that? And we can work on it some more if you want additional, if you're committed to this, because I really do want to sort of like use this as an opportunity to try out if this collaborative mapping thing can actually work. All right, see you on Saturday.